Is Tim Townsend. I'm a professor at the University of Florida here in Gainesville. I'm in the Department of Environmental Engineering. And what we wanted to do today was share a little bit about some work underway at the University of Florida in terms of PFAS. The idea was that there probably are a number of folks around the state of Florida and beyond who might be interested in some of the things that we're doing. If you don't mind, Ash, let's go to the next slide, please. So this big picture, my area of expertise is solid waste. That deals with a number of different solid waste, including MSW or municipal waste, construction, demolition, debris. And one of the things that we've been dealing with quite a bit lately is with regard to PFAS. And I think probably everybody on the call is familiar with what PFAS is, but the University of Florida, a number of faculty here have been investigating PFAS-related issues in the state of Florida. What we want to do today was to give an overview of some of the PFAS research interests, questions, and activities that the University of Florida has been involved with regard to PFAS impacted materials at airports and then also at military bases, DoD facilities. The goal behind the presentation here today is to give you an opportunity to learn what we're doing, what our interests are, perhaps to share some information that you might want to contact us more about in the future, to open up doors for potential participation. Our real goal here is to provide a collaborative effort to folks in the state of Florida to be able to answer questions and to help move this issue along. So I have a team of students here who are going to present here in a second. So I'm gonna let them go through some of this. But next slide, please, Ashley. So big picture. Again, I don't need to share with you the fact that PFAS is a challenge when it comes to these types of facilities. Whether we're talking about airports, private public airports, or whether we're talking about military bases, DoD facilities, federal facilities. But the use of AFFF, of course, has resulted in challenges with regard to PFAS. Our involvement with PFAS really started looking at municipal solid waste landfills and what's in leachate. But PFAS is everywhere. One of the big challenges is at these facilities where AFFF is used. That involves not only potential contamination of soils, and this is something that a number of facilities are dealing with or trying to figure out what to deal with. It also involves the pavements. And so asphalt and concrete pavements at these facilities are growing interest because of the amount of historic AFFF and PFAS that now resides in them or has been applied to them, looking at not only what to do about the existing pavement areas that have PFAS in them. Are they a potential source, an ongoing source, for example, to PFAS in the environment? But what do you do with these materials once they are ultimately discarded? Concrete and asphalt, very heavily recycled materials in the state of Florida, in the United States. And so a very valid question is how does the presence of PFAS as a result of AFFF in these pavements, how does it impact recycling opportunities? Or does it all need to be landfilled? And what are the issues associated with that? We've got a new project which we'll talk about with the kind of, it's a organization, CERTUP, which is a DoD, DOE, EPA organization, with a number of other institutions around the country. They're going to be looking at this issue. And what we wanted to do was to give you not only an overview of that ongoing project, but just a few of the more general PFAS related issues and discussion topics that are out there, and share a little bit about what we're doing at the University of Florida. So if you have any interest, what we're going to do is, as I said, we're recording this and we'll send out a copy of the link to this presentation if you want to share that with others later. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jake, who's going to go ahead and talk a little bit about our capabilities and what we do at the University of Florida, and then we'll go through some of the work and some of the things you might be interested in. So go ahead, Jake.
as Dr. Townsend said, we research solid waste here at the Sustainable Materials Management Research Lab, or SMMRL. So historically, this has been looking at all types of problems related to solid waste management. So looking at new ways to beneficially reuse or recycle existing waste streams, looking at the life cycle analysis related to tons of CO2 generated or plastic generation by doing different waste management options, and also looking at environmental contaminants and their potential releases through our current management strategies of solid waste. And this is where our research with PFAS ties in. So PFAS are these new emerging contaminants, and we've already published a number of works related to PFAS in different solid waste streams. So many of you on this call already know what PFAS are. I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of background on them, but I want to kind of introduce some topics here that are going to show up later in our presentation. So PFAS are not just one chemical, but potentially thousands and thousands of different chemicals. They're just classified by having these carbon-fluorine bonds. They have some pretty unique chemical physical properties, being both hydrophobic and lipidophobic. They're also good surfactants. They're thermally and chemically stable, and this has led to their extensive use in one particular product that we're going to talk a lot about, which is aqueous film-forming foams, or AFFF. So for the last 50 to 60 years, the main ingredient in these firefighting foams has been PFAS. And as I've mentioned, there's like 4,000 different chemicals, and the types of PFAS that have been used have changed over the years. There's issues related to that. But, you know, I also said that PFAS are thermally and chemically stable, which means that they're also thermally and chemically stable in the environment. And with new toxicity information available, there's been this push from regulatory agencies to start regulating certain kinds of PFAS in different environmental matrices. And this is where, you know, there's been a drive for this research that we've been doing. So some background on our previous work, we've looked at things like wastewater sludge and landfills. And these are, you know, complicated matrices to work with. We've also looked at landfill gas, which is not a lot of labs are analytically capable of looking at volatile PFAS. So kind of building upon all this work, we've developed a very robust method or number of methods to look at different kinds of PFAS depending on what we're interested in. So we have pretty advanced analytical capabilities compared to all the other labs, especially in the Southeast, that could do PFAS analysis. We can do target analysis of 92 PFAS. We have a targeted method for volatile PFAS that actually just developed. We also have a non-targeted analysis method where we can potentially look at these thousands of other PFAS that we're missing. So remember, there's potentially thousands and thousands of these other PFAS that could be used that are going under the radar. And then also we're currently working to update our lab to also run the new EPA draft method 1633. So that way all our results are comparable to other laboratory groups who are running that method. So this previous work really sets us up well to answer some of these remediation challenges that Dr. Townsend mentioned previously. So AFFF and PFAS impact has become a very hot topic recently, and there's thousands of sites across the United States that have been identified as containing high levels of PFAS through the historic use of AFFF. So we see not only is there remediation needs regarding, you know, soil and groundwater, but an issue that Dr. Townsend brought up and something that Allie's going to talk about is the pavements. And then also, once you have all this impacted material, how do you actually manage it in an effective way? And that's something that I'm going to pass over to Ashley to kind of talk about, which is the management of soil once you have addressed excavation.
Yeah, so just to reiterate a couple of things that Dr. Townsend and Jake had mentioned is that there's this real push for regulation nationwide with regard to PFAS impacted materials. And so currently in our management strategy, right, we might have an impacted site, and what that might involve for remediation or management is that we go to that site, we excavate these impacted materials, and traditionally what we do is we will landfill that material. But through research, even in our group specifically, right, we understand that landfills aren't a long-term management strategy for PFAS because it's essentially just like a retainer for it. Eventually, PFAS mobilize from landfills into the leachate that's generated, or even in the gas that Jake had mentioned earlier. And so really landfilling or even stockpiling ultimately is just this Band-Aid solution. And ideally, right, we'd be able to actually address the problem and treat the materials. But there are a lot of questions remaining with traditional treatment technologies or even emerging treatment technologies with regard to PFAS contamination. So obviously, a lot of people are interested in this issue, and a lot of research has been conducted on PFAS treatment. But the issues really are that a lot of existing technologies are smaller scale technologies. And when we think about traditional soil remediation, for example, like at an oil spill site or petroleum contaminated site, we're talking about very large quantities of soil that not necessarily these niche lab scale technologies are going to be able to address. So what a lot of research and science has shifted towards is investigating traditional technologies such as thermal desorption paired with oxidation, where essentially you just take contaminated media, you desorb the contaminants off of it at a lower temperature. In this case, it's PFAS, right? And then that off gas gets sent to a higher temperature unit where the destruction really occurs. But we have a lot of knowledge gaps in terms of PFAS, right? So in an ideal treatment scenario, you might have a PFAS contaminated media. You put it through some form of treatment, and the ideal, or I guess like the outcome that you're looking for, is that you have made all of the fluorine and the potential PFAS present in that media inert. And so if it leaches, which it shouldn't, there won't be environmental risk or harm associated with that material. And then we can effectively manage it without having to worry about environmental implications later on. So when we think about traditional thermal treatment and apply it to the same concept, a lot of the issues have to do with primarily, right, the scale of it. So at the laboratory scale and even smaller pilot scale studies, people have done this work and looked at PFAS treatment and desorption oxidation. But when we talk about large quantities, there really isn't a single study out there that's been able to successfully assess if this technology is efficient for PFAS treatment, and also really assess the harm of the emissions that come off the material. So just to kind of walk through that emissions part of it, it's essentially you have, for example, one PFAS present in your soil, which this is just an example. There are thousands, obviously, and hundreds potentially in impacted materials. But PFOA, for example, we might take it through a traditional remediation technology. But if you don't apply enough thermal energy and you're not applying the correct analytical tools, you're going to miss some things, and potentially there will be this formation where you fragment only partially, and then you form these short chain, we call them products of incomplete combustion. So CF4, C2F6 are some examples, and these are really persistent and also mobile in the environment, right? So there's really that major question about emissions, and we have a lot of ongoing research at the university related to these problems in PFAS, but also just, you know, the things that we're going to really focus on today, which are, is this DoD project, essentially, that falls under DoD. A lot of you have probably heard of it. Sorry, what was that?
Hello?
Okay. Sorry. A lot. Sorry. So sort of, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the grant or the project, but you know, we're one of many teams that's interested nationwide in understanding PFAS impacts at military and airport and DoD sites. So I'm going to pass it off to Allie, and she's going to talk a little bit more about project specifics with this upcoming work.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, just to give a little bit of background on our work with CERDUP and where we go from here. So in 2022, there was a request for proposals to investigate the leachability of PFAS from these pavements that have been impacted with AFFF at the facilities that we've been talking about so far. In 2023, we were awarded the CERDUP grant to pursue the research, and now as of 2024, our contract has just been initiated, and we have almost the green light to get going with this work, which is very exciting for us. And still in the early developmental stages, which is why we're here to talk today. To give a little brief project overview, we kind of think about the project in 3 different tasks, just to help us compartmentalize what's going to be going on. So in task 1, we are going to work to identify these AFFF impacted pavements at DoD facilities and other facilities that have fire suppression systems using AFFF that has PFAS in its formulation. Thankfully, there's great record of where AFFF has been used, but this only tells us so much, and there's a lot of anecdotal information that we lack as a university, and that's where stakeholder information becomes very relevant to us. Then in task 2, once we identify those sites and narrow down our scope of work, we're going to go out and collect some AFFF impacted pavements, ideally with the help of some facilities, and we'll analyze them in the lab with a variety of tests to evaluate the mobility under different conditions. In task 3, we will take it another step further and generate our own pavements here in the lab and expose them to AFFF and evaluate the leaching in a lab-controlled setting. So those field pavements give us a great wealth of knowledge, but they really only give us a snapshot of that pavement's life. That pavement had a life before we met it, and so we are going to look at the lab-generated ones to give us sort of more thorough look at the lifespan of the AFFF on the pavement. So we'll do that in a couple of different experiments. Diving further, as I mentioned, we're seeking sites with known historic AFFF usage on paved surfaces. We'll hopefully combine the available records and reports with some anecdotal evidence from interested stakeholders to help us build a thorough knowledge of what's going on here in the Southeast and move on from there. In task 2, the first part of task 2 is collecting these pavements. The goal of this part of the process would be we would conduct an initial site screening visit to find those suspected areas and narrow down where we're looking. We'll start with a non-invasive superficial drilling for pavement dust, analyze that back at the lab, and then make sure that it meets the requirements to be a good candidate in our study. At which point we will go back out, collect those AFFF impacted pavement samples from the sites that we've already screened, and ideally we'll collect both cores and crushed pavement if there are stockpiles on site. Any candidate site could have one or the other or both, but we're really just hoping to build a good data set with a variety of different pavement types. Once we get those samples back to the lab, we'll evaluate PFAS in 2 different ways. We'll do extractable PFAS with a solvent extraction and leachable PFAS using some EPA test methods that our lab has built up over the years and with experience. EPA has a variety of test methods to evaluate leaching under different conditions, and so we will evaluate these in the lens of PFAS. So the first test method that we would use is we would use the pavement cores in a monolith leaching scenario.
Hi.
Hello? Okay, I'll continue. Thank you. So the monolith would be submerged into a container of water, and then the water is sampled at distinct time intervals so that we can build an understanding of the time scale of leaching and the liquid to solid ratio of leaching in a monolith scenario. We would also employ a batch leaching test where maybe the cores are crushed into a smaller size fraction, or we use the pre-crushed debris and we rotate it end over end at a liquid to solid ratio of 10 with clean water and evaluate the leaching in that scenario. Based on those results, we may pursue an additional test method to look at the flow-through leaching for PFAS. So typically these tests are done for permeable materials. Of course, we're looking at pavement, concrete, and asphalt, which are not typically very permeable. So this will be a little bit modified, but this would help us look at the flow-through leaching given the results of our other tests. So as I mentioned, it's very important to look at the snapshot of the pavement life cycle when we collect those field scale samples, but we also want to take it back to the lab scale so we can really study what the leaching looks like from beginning to end when AFFF first hits the pavement to when it runs off of the pavement. So for the first part of our lab scale tasks, we'll fabricate concrete with both virgin aggregate and cement according to a representative pavement mix design that may be seen at an airport or a military facility. And we'll batch them into pre-formed molds that are slab-like. At which point we'll apply AFFF to the pavement according to the varied formulations and dilutions that you can see in the table on the right side of the screen. And then we'll evaluate PFAS in the runoff So again, this just gives us more control to observe the way the PFAS leach off, and hopefully we can build a very interesting curve to see how they run off. And then when those pavement slabs are finished with this leaching runoff experiment, we can take those slabs and create our own cores and measure how deep the PFAS may travel into the concrete over that time as well. And the second part of our lab scale work is to make concrete that contains AFFF-impacted aggregates. This will help us look at reuse scenarios for all of these stockpiles of impacted materials. So there will ideally we'll see an AFFF-impacted concrete and asphalt. We'll mix them out into their own designs. So there'll be new aggregates into their own concrete, at which point we will perform that monolith leaching test as I described earlier, as well as some concrete performance analyses to see how the concrete behaves with these different aggregates in there. Of course, there's a wealth of knowledge on the concrete mix side of things, and we want to be able to evaluate how the concrete performs and how the threat that it may pose for leaching in the future. So given all of that that's been said, we are still in the early formative stages of our work. And so we are seeking AFFF-impacted pavements, both asphalt and concrete, both intact and in debris. These are, this is emerging work, and we're so excited to be a part of it. And as Dr. Townsend mentioned earlier, we are a part of a handful of other projects that are performing similar work. So we're in this unique position in the Southeast in Florida, where location is a really driving factor. And we can help to hopefully sample at sites near us so that we can help to build a data set that covers the whole United States, where we are contributing to the Southeast portion to see how climate and weather may impact these sorts of leaching behaviors. We thank you all for joining us today. I'll hand it back over to Dr. Townsend to facilitate our discussion. But again, thank you for coming. We hope you found it interesting.
All right, good, Allie. Thank you, and Jake and Ashley. So again, kind of the idea here is just wanted kind of the stakeholders associated with this issue of AFFF and PFAS at airports and military bases, DoD facilities and such, to understand at the University of Florida, there's a pretty concerted effort to examine PFAS, particularly as related to this issue and these materials. Wanted you to know that these kinds of efforts were underway, and that we welcome the opportunity, of course, as the state university, to learn about what concerns you have, what issues you have. Wanted to definitely share with you the idea that there's this new CERTIP project, which again, there's a number of universities around the country doing this, and there's going to be an integrated effort among all these universities to try to figure out how best to go out and get samples. And so probably, and I would imagine a lot of you on the DoD facility side have already heard about this and perhaps have even been contacted, but the idea is that we'll be one of the players in that, and certainly welcome the opportunity to talk more. We'll go ahead and we're going to send out the recording of this, but just also wanted to take some time if anybody had any questions, or if anybody wanted to discuss anything about the topic, we're happy to do that. And again, feel free to reach out to us to set up a further conversation as well. So thanks for attending, and anybody want to ask anything?